Unit 2, Theoretical Perspectives in Psychopathology I. 2.2 Introduction. Psychopathology, or identifying the causes for psychological disorders, is a multifaceted endeavor. Researchers and clinicians have attempted to understand the abnormal behavior from a variety of perspectives. No one viewpoint offers the complete conceptualization of psychopathology. That is why current view of psychopathology integrates several viewpoints while making sense of abnormal behavior and its treatment. In this unit and the next one, we will discuss some of the most influential theoretical perspectives and the probable causal factors identified by them. But, before that, let us understand what is causation or etiology. 2.3 Causes and risk factors of psychopathology. Rothman, an American epidemiologist, 1976, p. 588, defined a cause as an event, condition or characteristic without which the disease would not have occurred. A risk factor can also be a cause, but all risk factors are not causes. A risk factor is the one that increases the chance of having a particular condition. Let's understand this with an example. Ishan's dietary habits are not good as it includes sugary, fried and fatty foods. For the sake of simplicity, we will call it unhealthy diet, and he is also overweight. Arjun has the same diet, unhealthy diet, but he is not overweight as he compensates for his calorie intake with his active lifestyle. Kabir has a healthy diet. His calorie intake is typical for someone of his age group, but he is also overweight. Kabir suffers from hypothyroidism, which results in slower metabolism that burns fewer calories. Here, we can clearly see that unhealthy diet is not necessarily a reason behind being overweight. According to Rothman's definition of a cause, as mentioned above, we have to be sure that the condition wouldn't have happened without this specific factor. So, in Ishan's case, we can say that his unhealthy diet led to him being overweight. However, if we talk about the general condition, it might not be so clear. Unhealthy diet definitely increases the chance of being overweight, but if we look at it carefully, we can see that what's causing weight gain is the difference between calories intake and calories burned. Since an unhealthy diet may increase the calorie intake, it eventually may increase the chance of gaining too much weight. Thus, the term that should be used here is risk factor. Now let us understand about what causes psychological disorders, or the etiology of psychopathology. Understanding the mental distress or the maladaptive behavior of the individual will help us in prevention and proper treatment of the same. However, complexity of human behavior makes it the most challenging one. Thus, many researchers have started using the term risk factors, variables correlated with an abnormal consequence, rather than causes. Rutter, 2006. Various terms can be used to specify the role a particular factor may play as an etiological or causal factor in abnormal behavior displayed by an individual. Some of these are described here. Necessary cause can be understood as a condition that must exist for a disorder to occur. For instance, general paresis, a degenerative brain disorder, cannot develop unless a person has contracted syphilis previously. Many mental disorders do not appear to have a necessary cause. Sufficient cause is a condition that guarantees the occurrence of a disorder. For example, hopelessness is understood to be a sufficient cause of depression, or the fact that if hopelessness occurs, then depression will also occur. However, it is important to note here that a sufficient cause may not be a necessary cause. So, we can say that hopelessness is not a necessary cause of depression. There are other causes or causal factors as well that lead to depression. Contributory causes are the ones that increase the probability of the occurrence of a disorder, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient for the disorder to occur. For example, Parental rejection may increase the probability of a child having difficulty in dealing with close intimate relationships later in life. Here, parental rejection is a contributory cause for difficulties that the individual may develop later in life, but it is neither necessary nor sufficient. Another important consideration while understanding the causes is the time frame in which they operate. There are distal causal factors which occur relatively early in life but manifest their effects after many years. For instance, if we take the above given example only, parental rejection or loss of a parent early in life may become a distal contributory cause predisposing an individual to depression later in life. There are proximal causal factors which operate shortly before the occurrence of symptoms of a particular disorder. For example, an event or a condition may prove too much for someone, triggering the onset of a disorder. Divorce could lead to depression. A reinforcing contributory cause is the one that maintains the already occurring maladaptive behavior. For instance, some secondary gain like sympathy, relief from unwanted responsibility due to illness could be some of the examples. Another interesting example here could be that when a person has depression, their behavior alienates them from friends and family, which further enhances their sense of rejection, reinforcing the existing depression. Joyner and Timmons, 2009. For most forms of psychopathology, we do not have an answer as to what is a necessary or a sufficient cause behind them, but we do have a sound understanding of various contributory causes. We have a fair understanding of proximal, distal and reinforcing causal factors as well, but the picture is further complicated by the fact that what is a proximal cause at one stage may also serve as a distal contributory cause, predisposing the individual to a disorder in later life. For example, loss of a parent can be a proximal cause for grief reaction of a child but may also serve as a distal contributory cause for later if the child develops depression as an adult. Another useful categorization is grouping them into predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors. Predisposing factors are those that determine the vulnerability to other causes that are present at the time of illness, something that puts the individual at risk of developing an illness or a problem, for instance, genetic endowment, some birth trauma, psychological factors during infancy or childhood. Precipitating factors are the ones that occur shortly before the onset of a disorder, so they trigger the onset of a problem. These can be physical, brain injury caused by accident, or psychological, loss of a loved one, in nature, or even a combination of the two. Perpetuating factors are the ones that maintain a disorder once it occurs. Understanding of perpetuating factors plays an important role while deciding a line of treatment for the individual. 2.4 Theoretical perspectives in psychopathology. 3 major shifts have occurred to understand psychopathology. First is the biological approach, which is also considered as the dominant force in psychiatry and has been quite influential in clinical science. Second is the psychological approach, psychodynamic, behavioral and cognitive behavioral approach. Third is the socio-cultural approach, which is also becoming quite influential among psychologists and psychiatrists. Given the fact that human behavior is quite complex, none of the approaches are either complete or equally valid to explain all aspects of human behavior. Hence researchers and practitioners have agreed upon that an integrated approach, biological, psychological and socio-cultural, is most likely to provide us with a more holistic understanding of various forms of psychopathology. Thus, the need for a biopsychosocial approach which believes that all these factors interact and play a role in psychopathology and its treatment is the need of the hour. In this unit, we will discuss different theoretical approaches and their key tenets to understand psychopathology. 2.5 The biological approach. The biological approach understands mental disorders as mental diseases and thus views them as disorders of central nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and endocrine system. These disorders could be inherited or caused by some pathological process. However, explanations to various medical conditions cannot be very simplistic, so various psychological and socio-cultural factors along with biological are at play. In this unit, we will focus on 4 categories of biological factors. 1. Neurotransmitter and hormonal abnormalities in brain or other parts of central nervous system. 2. Genetic vulnerabilities. 3. Temperament. And 4. Brain dysfunction and neural plasticity. These categories often interact with each other and different factors end up playing more or less important roles in different individuals. 1. Neurotransmitter and hormonal imbalances. Human body is made up of a complex network of neurons which serve as the building blocks of the nervous system. They transmit information to and from the brain and throughout the body. For brain to function effectively, neurons should be able to communicate with one another efficiently. When a neuron spikes, it releases neurotransmitter, a chemical that travels a tiny distance across synapse before reaching other neurons, which results in communication with hundreds of other neurons. The biological model believes that imbalances in neurotransmitters, in the brain, can result in abnormal behavior. Recent researches suggest that it could be an important cause but only a part of the causes involved in the etiology of disorders. Factors affecting neurotransmitter imbalance may include, there can be excessive production and release of the neurotransmitter substance in the synapses. So, it will end up causing excess in levels of that particular neurotransmitter. Disruption or dysfunction of normal processes may lead to deactivation of the neurons after their release into synapse. Either of the 2 processes could be involved in it. They are a. Reuptake of released neurotransmitter from synapse into axon endings, or b. Degradation by certain enzymes present in synapse and presynaptic axon endings. Receptors in postsynaptic neuron could be either abnormally sensitive or abnormally insensitive. Different disorders may occur because of different patterns of neurotransmitter imbalances in various areas of the brain, and medications are used to correct these imbalances. For instance, Prozac is an antidepressant drug which is used to slow down the reuptake of neurotransmitter serotonin so that it can remain in the synapse for a longer duration. Various neurotransmitters have been discovered over the years, but the ones that are widely studied in the context of psychopathology are norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, and gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA. Dopamine has been implicated in schizophrenia, addictive disorders, GABA in anxiety disorders, norepinephrine in emergency reactions of the body, serotonin in disorders related to mood, depression, and anxiety as well. Psychopathology has also been linked to hormonal imbalances. Hormones are chemical messengers which travel in our bloodstream to tissues or organs. They are secreted by endocrine glands in our bodies and affect various processes such as growth and development, metabolism, mood, sexual function, reproduction, etc. Our central nervous system is linked to the endocrine system via effects of hypothalamus on the pituitary gland. Malfunction of this system can be responsible for different forms of psychopathology. For instance, one such important interaction occurs at the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, refer to Figure 2.2. Prolonged stress may lead to secretion of adrenal hormone cortisol, which may elevate blood sugar levels and increase metabolism. These changes can be helpful in sustaining prolonged bodily activity but at the cost of immune system activity. Malfunctioning here has been implicated in depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. 2. Genetic factors. A healthy human cell has 46 chromosomes, which contains the genetic material with hereditary plan encrypted for each individual. Basically, genes are carriers of information that we inherit from our parents and ancestors. Behavior or any mental disorder is not exclusively determined by genes or genetic abnormality, but they definitely have a role to play. Plominit al. 2008. As discussed, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 in total, one of each pair from the mother and the other one from father. 22 pairs of these determine our general characteristics, and the remaining pair is the sex chromosome, which determines an individual's sex. In females, it is designated as XX chromosome and XY in males. Abnormalities in the structure or number of these chromosomes can be one of the causes for disorders. For instance, there is a trisomy in the 21st chromosome in Down syndrome. This extra chromosome is considered as the main cause of the disorder, which involves intellectual disability, flat face, slanted eyes, etc. We often hear a statement that the gene that is involved in a particular disorder has been discovered. It is important to note here that vulnerabilities to mental disorder are usually polygenic in nature, that is, they are influenced by multiple genes, not just one. Kendall, 2005. Two terms that are important to be discussed in this context are genotype and phenotype. Genotype is a person's total genetic endowment, and except for identical twins, no one begins life with same endowment. Phenotype involves the observable characteristics of an organism that result from the interaction of genotype, genetic inheritance, with the environment. Phenotype may keep changing throughout the life of an individual because of various environmental and physiological changes in our lifetime. Sometimes these genotypic vulnerabilities do not exert their effect on phenotype until later. For instance, children with genetic vulnerability to phenylketonuria, PKU, react differently to foods with phenylalanine, as they cannot metabolize food with phenylalanine, than their so-called normal counterparts. If the child carrying PKU gene is not given the food with phenylalanine, he/she will not develop the disorder despite being predisposed to it genetically. Then there are times when genotype may shape the environmental experiences early in life, and this may affect the phenotype in turn. For example, a child genetically predisposed to aggressive tendencies may be rejected by his peers. This in turn may lead the child to further associate with similar aggressive peers later in life, leading to a strong possibility of developing a pattern of delinquency. Now let us pay attention to the methods for determining genetic influences. Behavior genetics have proposed three primary methods that we will talk about here: the family history method, the twin method, and the adoption method. The family history method identifies the degree of risk of relatives developing mental disorders that other family members suffer from. The investigator observes samples of relatives of each proband, carrier of the trait or disorder, to determine if the incidence increases in proportion to the degree of hereditary relationship. The incidence of the disorder in a normal population is compared with its incidence among relatives of the proband. Zhang, 2005. Studies carried out on people with bipolar disorder demonstrated that first-degree relatives of people with bipolar disorder are at a higher risk for related mental disorders like bipolar I, bipolar II, unipolar and schizoaffective disorders. However, they were not at an increased risk for schizophrenia. Berettini, 2000. Another method used is twin studies. Identical twins, monozygotic twins, are siblings who have the same genotype. They are the best indicators of whether biology affects traits and psychopathology in humans. Fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, share half their genes with each other. They are not as optimal as identical twins to decipher the degree of genetic influence, but they are a good basis for comparison with identical twins. Fraternal twins are like first-degree relatives, except for the fact that they share the exact same age like identical twins. Now, if biology has a greater role to play than environment, then identical twins should develop psychopathology similar to each other, more so than the fraternal twins. But, it is also possible for identical twins to express different phenotypes for the same genotypes. So, even though the identical twins share the same genetic makeup, they may have different experiences which may shape their personality, behavior and psychopathology. Hughes et al., 2005. The third method is the adoption studies. Here, the prevalence of psychopathology in adopted children is examined as a result of psychopathology in their biological parents and adoptive parents. A genetic influence is suggested if there is a significant association between psychopathology in the adopted children and their biological parents. For certain disorders such as schizophrenia, anxiety, mood, twin studies and adoption studies have confirmed significant genetic effects, but they have also equally emphasized on the environmental effects, which may not just include family environment but also the prenatal environment of the child. With the revolution in molecular genetics, newer methods such as linkage analysis and association studies have started contributing to our knowledge about the exact location of genes which could be contributing to a mental disorder. 3. Temperament. Temperament refers to stable, early appearing individual differences on our behavioral tendencies that have a constitutional basis. Goldsmith et al., 1987. When we talk about difference in temperament of babies, we are basically meaning that they show differences in their arousal and emotional response to different stimuli and the way they approach or withdraw from these situations. These factors are influenced by genetic influences, but prenatal and postnatal environmental factors play a role in their development. Goldsmith, 2003. One of the most common birth difficulty associated with learning disabilities and behavioral disorders is low birth weight. Prenatal conditions that can lead to premature birth include nutritional deficiencies, drugs, exposure to radiation, emotional distress in mother, etc. Socioeconomic status could also be related to birth difficulties. Approximately 5 dimensions of temperament have been identified, such as fearfulness, irritability and frustration, positive affect, activity level, and attentional persistence and effortful control. They are related to some important dimensions of adult personality: neuroticism, extraversion, and constraint, conscientiousness. For example, a child with fearful temperament may eventually become conditioned to fear situations in which fear is provoked, and later the child may learn to avoid entering such situations or end up fearing social situations, thus developing a risk for anxiety disorders. 4. Brain dysfunction and neural plasticity. Our knowledge about brain structure has gradually increased with advances in neuroimaging techniques such as computed tomography, CT, and magnetic resonance imaging, MI. For instance, neuroimaging in patients with schizophrenia shows dilated cerebral ventricles and reduced frontal lobe density, indicating that origin of schizophrenia may have some neurodevelopmental basis. Neuroimaging has also helped us in distinguishing between different types of dementia. These techniques have also shown that genetic programs for brain development are not very rigid, and there is neural plasticity, flexibility of the brain in making changes in organization and function as a response to prenatal, postnatal experiences, stress, diet, diseases, etc. So, the existing neural circuits can be modified or new ones can be generated. Colbert et al., 2003. Impact of biological perspective. Biological perspective has had an important role to play in our understanding of human behavior. Its emphasis on the role of biochemical factors and innate characteristics has provided useful insights for both normal and abnormal behavior. The developments in pharmacotherapy and drugs have further solidified faith in this model, as they seem to have immediate results than other available therapies. 2.6 The psychodynamic approaches. Psychoanalytic perspective originated in the work of Sigmund Freud and emphasized the role of unconscious psychological processes, for instance, wishes and fears of which we are not completely aware. It believes that childhood experiences have an important role to play in shaping the personality of an adult, normal or abnormal. Psychoanalytic perspective has evolved considerably since then and now included newer and more innovative approaches and is called a psychodynamic approach. Although very popular, various aspects of psychoanalytic theory have been controversial. Let's discuss the tenets and ideas of this theory. 1. Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Freud introduced a topographic model of the mind, according to which the mind could be divided into three regions: conscious, preconscious or subconscious, and unconscious. The conscious part represents a smaller area, holding the information that you are focusing on at this moment. The preconscious contains material that is not conscious right now but is capable of becoming conscious if attention is directed towards it. The unconscious is a much larger part that contains anxiety-producing material, such as hurtful memories, forbidden desires, which has been repressed, held out of conscious awareness. However, unconscious material seeks expression through dreams, slip of tongue, etc. Freud believed that it is important to bring such unconscious material to conscious awareness and integrate it, or else it may lead to irrational and maladaptive behavior. Structure of personality, ID, ego, and superego. Freud theorized about three important components of an individual's personality: ID, ego, and superego. It is the interaction of these that drives human behavior. The ID has been considered as the seat of instincts, impulses and drives and appears in infancy. It is unconscious and operates on the pleasure principle. It is concerned with immediate gratification of instinctual needs without any consideration about morality. Freud divided its instincts into two: life and death instincts. Life instinct, eros, involves those that are crucial for pleasurable survival, such as eating, or the drives that are primarily sexual in nature. Death instinct, thanatos, is our unconscious wish to die, as death puts an end to all the everyday life struggles and misery. It indirectly represents itself through aggression. The ego represents the logical and reality-oriented parts of the mind, operates on the reality principle. The ego ideally tries to mediate between the demands made by the ID and external world realities, for instance, finding an appropriate time and place to fulfill a need. Along with fulfilling its demands, ego ensures the well-being and survival of the individual. It includes defensive, perceptual, intellectual, cognitive and executive functions. The demands made by ID, especially the sexual and aggressive strivings, are at a conflict with the norms and rules of society. As children grow, they learn the rules that society and parents have set for them, and this leads to the emergence of superego. It includes internalized taboos, moral values, prohibitions, sense of right and wrong from the society, ego ideals, spiritual ideals, and conscience. Gradually it becomes the inner control system that tries to deal with the unrestrained desires of the ID. Our personality reflects the interplay of these three psychic structures, but it may differ from individual to individual. Often a major reason for inner mental conflicts is that these systems strive for different goals, and if these intrapsychic conflicts remain unresolved, it may lead to mental disorder, S. When the ID predominates, it may result in an impulsive personality. Dominance of superego may result in a restrained and over-controlled personality. With a strong ego, a more balanced set of personality may develop. Eagle, 2011. If we personify the ego, it's like a slave to three hard taskmasters: ID, superego and the external world. Its job is to please all the three, thus is constantly under pressure of displeasing the other two. It is believed that ego is more loyal to ID, but superego keeps a close watch on all the moves made by ego and thus inducing feelings of guilt and anxiety. In order to overcome this, the ego employs defense mechanisms. Anxiety and defense mechanisms. Anxiety can be defined as the generalized feelings of fear and apprehension. According to the Freudian view, anxiety plays an important role in all forms of psychopathology and it is present as a symptom in various neurotic disorders. For instance, if anxiety is repressed, it may get transformed into and manifested in other overt symptoms. Freud used the term conversion hysteria. Symptoms are an expression of repressed sexual energy converted into bodily disturbances. Conflict over masturbation might be solved by developing a paralyzed hand. It is important to note here that it happens unconsciously. Box 2.1 Types of anxiety. Reality anxiety. Anxiety caused from actual dangers. Neurotic anxiety. It is caused when its impulses are threatening to break through ego into behavior that will be punished. Moral anxiety, resulting from feelings of guilt. It has been seen that ego can cope with objective anxiety through various rational measures. Both neurotic and moral anxiety are difficult to deal with, especially using the rational measures. It could be because they are unconscious in nature. Thus, ego resorts to protective measures that help the individual in dealing with anxiety. These are called as ego defense mechanisms. These are the mechanisms that we use unconsciously and automatically when we feel threatened. Kramer, 2006. Although they help us in dealing with anxiety, there is a cost that is involved here. All ego defenses involve distortion of reality to some extent. A defense mechanism may become pathological only when its persistent use leads to maladaptive behavior resulting in adverse effects on the person's physical and or mental health. Some of these are described in Table 2.1. Neurosis has been understood as the conflict between ego and ID, whereas psychosis is the same conflict along with breakdown of outer reality and collapse of ego identity. Meinekar et al. 2017. For people with psychotic tendencies, inner experience of the outer world is oppressive. Weak ego. Psychosexual stages of development. Freud conceptualized 5 psychosexual stages of development that all of us pass through from infancy to puberty. Each stage has its mode of sexual gratification and a unique challenge to overcome. Frustration or over-gratification during a stage results in fixation at that stage. Fixation is the persistent and inappropriate attachment to an early psychosexual object or mode of gratification. These stages are as follows: oral stage, infancy to 2 years. During this stage, mouth is the principal erogenous zone and the greatest source of satisfaction is sucking. Anal stages, 2 to 3 years. Anal stimulation provides the source of pleasure, especially during this time when toilet training is in process and there is an urge for both elimination and retention. Phallic stage, 3 to 5 or 6 years. Self-manipulation of the genitals provides the major source of pleasure during this stage. At this stage, they also begin to make differences between males and females. This stage is also characterized by Oedipus and Electra complex. Latency, 6 to 12 years / puberty. During this stage, the child is preoccupied with developing skills, intellectual pursuits, and getting involved in various social activities. Here, the sexual motivations lie dormant. Genital stage, puberty onwards, sexual relations provide the deepest feelings of pleasure. As mentioned above, inappropriate gratification at any of the stages may lead to fixation. For example, inadequate oral gratification may lead to smoking, drinking, biting fingernails, some form of oral stimulation, as an adult. Thus, the aim is to receive as much instinctual gratification as possible with minimal punishment and guilt. 2. Newer psychodynamic perspectives. Freud paid a lot of attention to ID, its nature, demands, manner in which it can be transformed, etc. He also focused on the role played by conscience but paid relatively less attention to the ego. Later theorists developed basic Freudian ideas, paid attention to ego and expanded in different directions. Ego psychology. Anna Freud and other second-generation psychoanalysts were much concerned with ego and its function, as it is the executive of personality. They also elaborated upon the concept of ego defense mechanisms. Thus, psychopathology develops when ego doesn't make use of adequate and appropriate defense mechanisms while facing internal conflicts. Erik Erikson proposed a psychosocial theory of development which suggests that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan, departing from traditional Freudian view that personality is fixed in early years of life. Erikson emphasized on the importance of social relationships at every phase and stage of life. 8 psychosocial stages of personality development were identified, each of which represents a conflict or a developmental task. Refer Table 2.3. In order to develop a healthy personality, successful completion of the task at each stage is important. Failure or unsuccessful achievement at each stage can lead to various problems as an adult. Failure at the first stage, basic trust versus mistrust, can result in lack of trust and can bring about a sense of fear regarding inconsistencies that exist in the world. Heightened insecurity, anxiety and overall mistrust in the world can be a result. Hefner, 2001. The aim of the second stage, autonomy versus shame, is to develop self-control without losing one's sense of self and self-esteem. MacLeod, 2008. Those who fail at the third stage, initiative versus guilt, may possess feelings of guilt, self-doubt, and lack of initiative. At the fourth stage, industry versus inferiority, if the children are encouraged and assisted, they develop conscientiousness and a positive sense in their capability to formulate and achieve their goals. But discouragement or ignorance may make the child feel inferior, doubting his abilities and always following others around with lack of motivation. Hefner, 2001. The fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, is the period when the child is developing a strong sense of self, feeling of independence and control. Failure at this stage can make them unsure of their beliefs, making them apprehensive about themselves, their future and their identity. Unsuccessful achievements at the sixth stage, intimacy versus isolation, may result in individual avoiding intimacy, being scared of commitments and thus may suffer in isolation, leading to depression in certain cases. MacLeod, 2008. If the objectives of stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, are not achieved, we may become idle and feel lifeless and meaningless. At the eighth stage, ego integrity versus despair, if we see our lives as fruitless, unaccomplished, and guilty, we may become displeased life in general, be angry with ourselves, often leading to hopelessness and eventually depression. Hefner, 2001. Object relations theory. Another psychodynamic perspective is object relations theory, which was developed in the 1930s and 1940s by theorists such as Melanie Klein, Margaret Muller, W.R.D. Fairburn, and D.W. Winnicott. They talk about the individual's interaction with real and imagined people, understood as external and internal objects, and relationships we experience between our internal and external world. Ingler, 2006. Here, object refers to the symbolic representation of another person in the infant's or child's environment, most often a parent. It is through the process of introjection, unconscious process by which we incorporate characteristics of another person or object in our apparatus, we symbolically end up incorporating important people in our lives. For example, a child might internalize images of a punitive and demanding father. This image then may become a harsh self-critic, influencing how the child may behave further. These objects could also split off from the ego and maintain a separate independent existence. This may give rise to various inner conflicts, as now the person has to listen to and follow various commands and therefore may not lead an integrated life. Mahler, 1971, theorized that young children do not differentiate between self and object, so the first 3 years of life are based on a symbiotic relationship, but a successful completion of separation individuation is necessary for achievement of personal growth and maturity. Otto Kernberg, 1996, theorized that people with borderline personality are unable to achieve a stable identity, self, because they cannot integrate pathological internalized objects. Due to their inability to structure their internal world in a way that people can have a balance or a mix of both good and bad traits, they perceive the eternal world also in extremes, either good or bad. Interpersonal perspective. Another set of psychodynamic theorists emphasized that we are social beings and a major part of what we are is a product of our relationship with others. So, they believe that psychopathology somewhere is rooted in the maladaptive tendencies we have developed while dealing with our interpersonal environments. This focus on social and cultural factors in the psychoanalytic thought was introduced by Alfred Adler, 1870–1937. According to Adler, people are motivated by desire to belong to others and a group, and it is the future goal of attaining power which causes neurosis, not the sex drive. When a person is thwarted and discouraged, he/she will display counterproductive behaviors that seem like defeat, withdrawal, and competition. Adler asserted that all of us succumb to disease in the organ that is less developed, the one that is inferior from birth, and the environmental demands play a huge role on the inferior organ and the way in which the individual would adapt to life. He contended that these feelings of inferiority are not a sign of abnormality, rather a cause of improvements in humans. To summarize his view, it is important to understand personal life organization, birth order, social context and other dynamics such as parent-child interactions, how it has influenced self-worth, acceptance, and expectation. With this, the individual can gradually begin to accept the emotions they have in relation to the events they experience as a child. Eric Fromm, 1900–1980, paid attention to the orientations or dispositions that develop from assimilation of individual's character with social factors and his relation with the society. These are: I, the receptive character, always expect help from others; 2, the hoarding character, outside world is perceived as a threat and sense of security comes from keeping things to themselves; 3, the exploitative character, acquiring things by force; 4, the marketing character, their success depends on how well they can sell themselves; v, the productive character, the healthier type of the lot. We are supposedly a blend of all these 5 characters, but one or two may become prominent than others. When these orientations are maladaptive, they serve as basis for psychopathology. Karen Horney asserted that femininity was a product of culturally determined social learning and social factors are at genesis of neurosis. She suggested that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety which may stem from needs not being met, childhood experiences of loneliness or isolation. She mentioned 3 types of self in her theory. Actual self is the one that experiences things around. Real self that works as the guiding principle for healthy integration of human personality, and idealized self has the glorified images and is a major source of neurotic claims. Attachment theory. The attachment model of psychopathology as developed by Bowlby, 1973-1980, like other psychodynamic theories, focuses on early parent-child relationships. Bowlby seemed to be interested in the actual characteristics of the relationship, thus relied on the observational studies rather than analyzing retrospective reports of adults. The theory suggests that if parental behavior fails to make a child feel safe, secure and trusting in times of need, then the child will have issues in regulating emotions and may develop a negative, insecure view of themselves and others. This also puts children at risk for developing psychological disorders. Greenberg, 1999. Impact of psychodynamic approaches. One of the most important contributions of Freudian psychoanalysis is that it brought intrapsychic conflict and role of unconscious to the fore in understanding psychopathology rather than emphasizing only on genetic factors or brain pathology. He also developed 2 of the major psychoanalytic techniques, free association and dream analysis, to make sense of both conscious and unconscious aspects of an individual's life. It was through psychoanalytic theory that sexual factors received attention in human behavior and mental disorders. Although, it would be important to note here that Freudian usage of sex drive was not limited or narrow in definition. Psychodynamic viewpoint. Freud and his successors also gave a lot of importance to early childhood experiences in the development of both normal and abnormal personality. The idea that ego defense mechanisms are used by all of us to cope with difficult problems in life became a factor of realization that similar psychological principles apply to both normal and abnormal behavior. So, it is about the usage, intensity and the context sometimes that is the deciding factor. Traditional psychoanalysis has always been attacked for various reasons, such as its failure as a scientific theory to explain abnormal behavior, its inability to provide scientific evidence to support some of its assumptions. But, it has been particularly criticized for its emphasis or rather overemphasis on sex drive, for pessimism, giving too much importance to unconscious and its process, and for its condescending view of women. Later psychodynamic perspectives have tried to answer some of its criticisms by expanding on the traditional psychoanalytic ideas. For instance, Bowlby's attachment theory has generated massive research evidence to support its basic claims about normal and abnormal child development and adult psychopathology. Rutter et al., 2009. Recently, interpersonal approaches to psychotherapy have also garnered attention, especially for disorders such as depression, bulimia, and even some personality disorders. Benjamin, 2004. 2.7 The behavioral approaches. The behavioral perspective came up partly as a reaction to the unscientific methods of psychoanalysis. Behavioral psychologists believe that people do not improve by just talking and should be treated using various prescriptive and mechanical techniques. Their focus has been on external factors which shape an individual's behavior. Mahoney, 1977. So, in order to understand human behavior, we need to study directly observable behavior or overt behavior and the reinforcing conditions which build them and maintain them. So, the individual learns new and appropriate ways of acting in the therapy, and maladaptive behavior is replaced by the adaptive one. Behavioral perspective is firmly rooted in experimentally derived principles of learning, thus believes that pathology is also learnt. Pathology may occur due to faulty learning, biological deprivation and or failure to learn adaptive ways to act and behave. The main question addressed here is how learning occurs. 1. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs when two stimulus are paired repeatedly. In this case, a response which is at first elicited by the second stimulus is elicited by the first stimulus in the due course of time, due to repeated number of pairings. Food is a product that naturally elicits salivation. Pavlov, 1927, paired it with another stimulus that reliably preceded and signaled presentation of food, thus this second stimulus also came to elicit salivation. Figure 2.4 illustrates the process of classical conditioning. John B. Watson's experiment with little Albert is a perfect example of conditioning of fear response. Albert initially did not show any fear of a white rat, but after the rat was paired repeatedly with a loud and scary sound, produced by striking a hammer on a steel bar, the child eventually started crying whenever the rat was present. Prior to conditioning, the white rat was a neutral stimulus, loud, clanging sound was the unconditioned stimulus, and fear was the unconditioned response. By repeatedly pairing the rat with the loud sound, the white rat, now the conditioned stimulus, started evoking the fear response, conditioned response. The child's fear also got generalized to other white furry objects like teddy bears, etc. This phenomenon is known as generalization. This experiment also illustrates how phobias can form through classical conditioning. In some cases, even a single pairing of a neutral stimulus, for instance, a dog, and a fear-provoking experience, being bitten by the dog, can lead to feared response and phobia, being afraid of dogs. The responses paired via classical conditioning are well maintained over a period of time. However, if a CS is presented repeatedly without the UCS, the conditioned response may gradually extinguish. This gradual process is known as extinction and may return at some point in time, a process called as spontaneous recovery. It is the reappearance of conditioned response after a rest period. Bhutan and colleagues, 2006, emphasized that a weaker CR may still be elicited in an environmental context different from the one where extinction took place. For instance, even though extinction of fear has taken place in a therapist's office, it may not get generalized completely and may become visible outside the therapist's clinic. Mistkowski and Meinecke, 2007. Classical conditioning has been used as an important explanation to understand abnormal or maladaptive patterns of behavior as various physiological and emotional responses can be conditioned. This may include fear, anxiety, or sexual arousal and the arousal stimulated by drug abuse. Principles of classical conditioning also have implications for various forms of behavioral treatment. 2. Instrumental conditioning. Essential to instrumental, or operant, conditioning is the idea of reinforcement, delivery of a reward, pleasant stimulus, or removal of, or escape, from an aversive stimulus. New responses are learned and they recur if they are reinforced, stimulus-response connection. It is also believed that people learn a response outcome expectancy that response will lead to a reward outcome. So, if an individual is sufficiently motivated for the outcome, they will make the response learned to produce the outcome. Higher rates of reinforcement might be necessary to establish a response, but usually lower rates are sufficient to maintain it. Let's take an example to understand operant conditioning. A young girl who weighs normal starts losing weight. Her friends and family praises her for doing so. She may continue losing weight even if that means starving herself. Her controlled eating behavior may continue as she now associates praise and acceptance of others, which she might have craved for earlier, with reduction in her diet. Eysenck and Rachman, 2013, suggested a three-stage explanation of development of abnormal behavior. The first stage talks about a series of traumatic events that produce UCR in individuals. These responses may eventually result in neurotic behavior patterns. The second stage utilizes the classical conditioning paradigm directly and explains the generalization of anxiety to an unhealthy magnitude. The last and the final stage involves instrumental avoidance of painful or anxiety-provoking stimulus. Let us take an example, also given above, to understand this: a girl who has fear of dogs. The trauma of being bitten, US, would have produced a natural response pain. Now, whenever she sees a dog, CS, associates it with this traumatic event and runs away, CR. Running away and avoiding them, operant avoidance, produces relief from original anxiety and serves the purpose. Thus, the phobia and avoidance serve as a reinforcing stimulus. It has also been understood that new learning may occur as a result of positive reinforcement and old patterns are abandoned due to lack of reinforcement or even punishment. Unfortunately, what we learn, although rewarding for the time being, such as drugs, alcohol, etc., is not always useful in the long run. Sometimes we may also learn certain coping patterns, bullying, learned helplessness, which might be maladaptive rather than adaptive, especially in the long run. Behavioral therapy also plays a role in dealing with these issues. 3. Observational learning. All of us observe things and people around us, and we also learn through it. Learning through observation alone, Bandura, 1969, without directly experiencing an unconditioned stimulus or any sort of reinforcement is called as observational learning. For instance, young children can acquire new fears only by observing a parent or a peer getting scared of an object or a situation. Thus, they experience the fear of the parent or peer vicariously, and it becomes attached to an object which was earlier neutral for them, not evoking fear earlier. Minekar and Cook, 1993. Children can learn to be aggressive after watching their peers behaving aggressively or a celebrity they love behaving that way. Therefore, we can learn both adaptive and maladaptive behavior by observing them. Impact of behavioral approaches. The behavioral perspective tries to explain acquisition, maintenance, modification, and extinction of almost all kinds of behavior. Thus, maladaptive behavior has been understood as either a failure to learn necessary adaptive behavior or learning ineffective or maladaptive responses. Thus, the behavioral therapist focuses on changing or modifying specific behaviors and emotional responses. For instance, in order to treat a phobia, prolonged exposure or gradual exposure to the feared object is used. Tenets of behavioral viewpoint have also been used to reteach basic life skills such as wearing clothes themselves or feeding themselves. The behavioral approach is known mainly for its objectivity, precision, effectiveness, and empirical nature. A behavior therapist specifies what behavior is to be changed and how that is to be done. The effectiveness of the therapy can be easily evaluated by the degree to which the stated goals have been achieved or not. Despite this, it has to face certain criticisms such as it oversimplifies human behavior and is unable to explain its complexities. Another major issue it has faced is the fact that it seems to be concerned only with the symptoms and not their underlying causes. This creates a further problem that as the underlying root cause is not being dealt with, this or some other symptom may again erupt. 2.8 The cognitive behavioral approach. The cognitive behavioral approach traces its roots to learning principles and to cognitive science. So, the basic principles of classical and operant conditioning along with cognitive science have shaped various cognitive behavioral therapies. Cognitive psychology involves a study of basic mechanisms related to information processing, such as attention, memory, thinking, planning, decision-making, etc. The traditional, radical behavioral viewpoint did not give importance to the mental processes. It was Bandura who developed an early cognitive behavioral sort of an approach and emphasized that humans also regulate behavior by internal symbolic processes, called as thoughts. Currently, the cognitive or cognitive behavioral view on abnormal behavior is mainly focused on how thoughts and information processing can get distorted and lead to maladaptive behavior and emotions. Our thoughts, more than external stimuli, elicit reward and or punish our actions. Thus, to change a pattern of behavior we must change the pattern of thoughts underlying it. Hoyen and Kendall, 1979. Aaron Beck's, a cognitive psychologist, work has also influenced the cognitive behavioral view. He was mainly interested in studying what people said to themselves and the way they monitored themselves. He believed that people develop different schemas depending upon their temperament, capabilities, and their experiences in life, which guides their current processing of information. Cognitive behavioral approach integrates the cognitive restructuring approach of cognitive science with behavioral modification of behavioral viewpoint. So, both thoughts and behaviors causing distress are identified and the therapists work on changing the thoughts to readjust the behavior. Box 2.2 Some basic principles of cognitive behavioral approach. The cognitive principle: people's emotional reactions and behavior are strongly influenced by their cognitions, thoughts, beliefs, etc., and all of us react differently to similar events. So, there must be something else other than the event that determines the emotion interpretation of the event, depicted in Figure 2.5. The behavioral principle: it is believed that behavior can have strong impact on thoughts and emotions, and in particular changing what you do is a powerful way of changing thoughts and emotions. The continuum principle: cognitive behavioral approach believes that it would make more sense if we see mental health problems arising from exaggerated or extreme versions of normal processes rather than pathological states. Thus, psychological problems are at one end of a continuum, not on a different dimension altogether. The here and now principle: the focus is on understanding the processes that are currently maintaining the problem rather than what might have happened years ago that led to development of the problem eventually. The interacting systems principle: problems are understood as developments that occurs due to interactions between various systems: cognition, affect, behavior and physiology. These systems interact with each other and the environment: physical, social, family, economic and cultural. Schemas and cognitive distortions. Cognitive behavioral view rests on a basic assumption that the primary problem of an individual has to do with his construction of reality. Beck, 1983. While growing up, we develop views about ourselves, things around us, and people around us, and these help as guides through the complexities of life. These are called as schemas. But, sometimes we develop distorted views of connections between ourselves and the environment, and now these distortions guide us about how we think and feel regarding ourselves and process the world. We hold some schemas, even the distorted ones, with a lot of conviction, thus making them resistant to change. But in order to improve the person's behavior or symptoms, these schemas have to change. Interestingly, we are usually consciously unaware of our schemas. Our daily behavior and decisions are shaped by these frames of reference, but without our awareness of assumptions on which they are based. Box 2.3 How do we work out new experiences? Whenever we encounter a new experience, we try to make sense of it according to our existing cognitive framework, even if the information is to be reinterpreted in some way or distorted. Two of these basic processes are as follows: assimilation: it occurs when the individual encounters a new idea and transforms it so that it can be placed in the pre-existing cognitive structures. It is like filling the existing container. Accommodation: It is the process of changing the cognitive structure to accept something new from the environment as it cannot fit in otherwise. So, it's like reshaping the containers. We use both these processes throughout our lives to make sense of things around us. It's a fact that it is always difficult to change the existing assumptions, thus we reject or distort the new information. Therefore, accommodation is a difficult and a threatening process and also the basic goal of cognitive behavioral therapies. BAPCH, 1967, discussed 3 levels of thoughts which have a role to play in both normal and abnormal behavior. These are as follows: negative, automatic thoughts. These come to us spontaneously and seem quite plausible, but they can be distorted and associated with negative effect or dysfunctional behavior. They are specific thoughts triggered by specific events and can easily become conscious. Refer to Figure 2.6 to understand automatic thoughts with an example. Underlying assumptions or immediate beliefs. These are theories about how we and the world should operate and thus reside at a deeper level. They are more generalized and abstract and take the form of set of rules, shoulds, imperatives, or if-then statements that can have a disabling effect. Some of these ideas can be culturally reinforced, but these can be dysfunctional as they are rigid and overgeneralized. Core beliefs or schemas. They exist at a more fundamental level than assumptions and reflect deep-seated model of self and others. For instance, the self-schema of a person with depression is that of marking vulnerability, wherein they attribute their failure to internal, stable and global characteristics. These are not immediately accessible, so have to be inferred. They are usually learnt in childhood and may comprise of intense experience, at any age. Schemas are like lenses, so if you think you are unlovable, even if someone loves you, you will end up finding an ulterior motive in it. Thus, thoughts are most easily accessible, followed by assumptions and then cognitive schemas. So, in therapy, we first deal with these negative, automatic thoughts only. Different forms of psychopathology are characterized by different maladaptive schemas that have developed over the years and also due to adverse early learning experiences. Beckett al. 2005. These schemas lead to the distortions in thinking that are characteristics of various disorders such as anxiety, depression, and personality disorders. Table 2.4 describes some of the common core beliefs in some mental disorders. Research in this area has also shown that there are certain cognitive mechanisms that are involved in causing or maintaining these disorders. For instance, people with depression show memory biases and favor negative information over positive or neutral information. These biases have a major role in maintaining the individual's depressed state. Impact of cognitive behavioral approach in the contemporary times. The cognitive behavioral perspective is one of the most influential ones in understanding psychopathology and even treating it. Many practitioners and therapists have agreed that by changing the way we think about ourselves and others, alterations in human behavior is possible. It has found solid empirical support and has been highly recommended in treatment of various disorders such as anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and personality disorders. Studies about effects of emotions on cognition and behavior have also provided evidence for this approach. In the present unit, we discussed some of the theoretical perspectives in understanding psychopathology. In the next unit we will discuss some more approaches related to it. One thing to be noted here is that no one perspective alone can account for the complex variety of human maladaptive behavior. For instance, while making sense of depression, the more traditional psychodynamic approach will focus on intrapsychic conflict and childhood experiences. The behavioral viewpoint will focus on faulty learning of habits and the environmental conditions maintaining the disorder, whereas the cognitive behavioral viewpoint will focus upon the maladaptive schema learnt as a child and the immediate negative thought regarding the situation. Thus, the perspective we adopt will determine our perception of the behavior, type of evidence we would look for, and how we would interpret that data. 2.9 Let us sum up. While considering the causes of psychopathology, it is important to distinguish between necessary, sufficient, and contributory causal factors. Along with this, predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors also have a role to play. In order to investigate biologically based vulnerabilities, we need to consider neurotransmitter and hormonal imbalances, genetic factors, temperament, and brain dysfunction and neural plasticity. There are three methods to study genetic versus environmental influences on an individual: family history method, twin studies, and adoption method. Recently, linkage analysis and association studies have also been seen contributing to the knowledge about exact location of genes which could be contributing to mental disorders. In understanding psychologically based vulnerabilities, three primary perspectives have been developed since the 19th century: psychodynamic, behavioral, and cognitive behavioral. Psychosexual model emphasizes that personality development takes place through a sequence of stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, and each of them has its own unique mode of sexual gratification. Fixation at any stage can be a cause of abnormal behavior. Erikson's psychosocial theory of development emphasizes the social nature of our development and suggests that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan. Object relations theory is an offshoot of the psychodynamic perspective, which suggests that personality can be understood as reflecting mental images of significant figures that we form early in life in response to our interactions within the family. These may have implications for later interpersonal relationships. The behavioral viewpoint focuses on the role of learning in human behavior and attributes maladaptive behavior to a failure in learning adaptive behavior or learning inappropriate behavior. The cognitive behavioral view discusses how thoughts cognition gets distorted and can be a case of psychopathology. People's schemas and self-schemas have an important role to play in the way they process information and attribute outcomes to causes.